Welcome everyone to the second video in my little If I Could Make a Raid series. Today we'll be going over the next three bosses within the second wing: the warrior, the council fight, the hunter, and the druid. The quasi-ad fight, I guess you could say. If you haven't checked out my first video in the series, be sure to check that out as well, and I'd recommend you start there for some better context. Other than that, let's not waste any time and jump ahead right into the first boss, the warrior. When it comes to this fight, it is very similar to the Council in Hellfire Citadel in the way that if all three are within 25 yards of one another, instead of gaining immunity like they do in Hellfire Citadel, they get a buff that increases rage regeneration. That will be important later. When it comes to each of the warriors, they all have a personal buff that affects them in a major way. Starting with the Protection Warrior, he has a passive buff that increases the amount of rage gained from taking damage by 100%. The Fury buff encompasses a mechanic that will be explained in a bit, but the Fury Warrior's buff makes his enraged ability occur every time he reaches 50 rage instead of 100. Finally, the Arms buff is a debuff to the players that makes the raid take 20% more damage wholesale for 1 minute after his enraged attack occurs. While these buffs are unique to each of the warriors, the moment any of them die, their buff is transferred to the other warriors in a weakened state. This weakened state means 50% increased rage regeneration when attacked instead of 100, enraging at 75 instead of 50, and increasing damage taken after enraged by 10%. Overall, these are just the first things to possibly be considered when thinking of a kill order for the bosses. After all the trivialities, we can delve into the meat and potatoes of this fight. As a whole, each of the warriors gain rage over both time and taking damage. And at each multiple of 25 rage, the warriors use a designated ability. Starting with the Protection Warrior, he sticks to the main theme of incapacitating the raid for his smaller interval attacks, up to his enrage. At 25, he shield smashes and causes a 10-yard AoE stun that lasts for 5 seconds and does a small to medium amount of damage within the range. Getting on to 50, he spouts an intimidating shout for 20 yards that causes fear to erupt from anyone within range for 10 seconds. It does not do any damage to those affected, but it does apply a debuff that causes the players to take 25% more damage for the duration of the fear. Upon reaching 75, the Protection Warrior heroically throws 3 axes at random players, thus pinning the target and anyone else hit to the floor until the axe is destroyed. Finally, the Enrage ability initiates at 100 rage. Once enraged, he starts leaping to random players around the room, causing thunderclaps for 10 yards wherever he lands, doing more damage for every subsequent leap. To get the warrior to stop, everyone in the raid must be hit by either 1, the targeted leap, or 2, the thunderclap reverberation. So I was just thinking, stack, stack, stack. Now let's go over Fury's interval in raged attacks. If you had taken note on what I went over earlier, with the Fury Warrior's buff allowing him to enrage every time he reached 50 rather than 100 rage, you realize now that Fury only gets 1 interval attack before his enrage ability. This one attack at 25 rage empowers the warrior's axis with the Wrath of Dragonfire. He then faces his current target, hopefully the tank, and starts with a 10-second channel of non-stop attacks. This attack could be mitigated by having people stand with the tank to absorb some of the incoming damage from the constant strikes. Now, when I was trying to come up with an enrage ability for the Fury Warrior, I had to ask myself, of all the attacks that embody a Fury Warrior, what would that be? It had to be Blade Storm. At 50 rage, the Fury Warrior jumps into the middle of the room and does a raid-wide Blade Storm that diminishes in damage the farther away the player is from the boss. Now those are all the Fury Warrior's attacks. Now, last but not least, we have the Arms Warrior with his attacks. For those who have played Dark Souls 3, you may recognize these abilities. At 25 rage, the Arms Warrior finds the closest person to him and does an Impale attack, doing not only decent damage, but applies a bleed that lasts 1 minute, and adding further damage. Secondly, with 50 rage, he finds the largest group of players and jumps into the air, impaling the ground, doing AoE damage and knocking down affected players. And thirdly, attaining 75 rage makes the warrior target the furthest person away from him, and after finding his target, he does an AoE pushback for anyone within 10 yards and begins to charge. Upon reaching the desired player, he elegantly spins and does a swipe, doing 10% increased damage for anyone hit in his path while he was charging. That's the reason for the pushback. Finally, when the Fury Warrior enrages, he's had enough of everyone and charges to every player in the raid. Each player emanates a 5-yard AoE around himself once charged, so this is the complete opposite of the Protection Warrior's stack, stack, stack. So spread, spread, spread. Okay, that covers the main mechanics for the Warrior Council fight. Nothing too difficult, but now let's move on to the Mythic fight. For many of the fights, when it came down to mythic mechanics, I've stuck to adding a phase, and originally the warrior fight was going to be the same. However, after a minute of me looking through what I had written down for the encounter, I knew I had to change it. Believe me when I say that what I think I came to is so much better, at least in terms of uniqueness compared to the common trend among the other fights. The inspiration for the new mythic mechanic came to me when I began thinking about Abyss Watchers from Dark Souls 3, in the fact that once the third Watcher spawned, he started fighting the other Watchers. I immediately thought, of any of the classes, rage-fueled warriors would be the kind of people to do the same. So a couple of new things have been added to the base fight to spice it up a little. First of all, instead of all three having to be within 25 yards to give the rage regeneration buff, even having just 2 of the warriors that close causes the buff to start. So this fight would essentially require 3 tanks for 3 warriors. That's not the only thing you'll have to worry about though. If any 2, or rarely even all 3, end up within 15 yards of one another, they drop their weapons and square up. This brawl greatly increases the affected warrior's rage generation. As they wail on one another, this is a race to enrage. Once either one of the combatants reaches 100 rage, this includes the Fury Warrior, their enrage causes them to win the brawl and then execute their associated enraged ability thereafter. A note before I continue, concerning the Fury Warrior that is. When it came to the Fury brawling, I did not want to give him an unfair advantage outright by allowing him to enrage at 50 like he normally would, or that would essentially cause him to win pretty much every brawl he's involved in, unless the other warriors are already on the cusp of enrage. Therefore, to try settling things down to how the Fury Warrior's enrage is handled while brawling, I decided making his rage bar proportional from where we started, and wherever he ends, once the fight is over, would be the proper solution to the rage problem. As a quick example, if the Fury Warrior were to start the brawl at 23 rage, he would immediately jump from 23 out of 50 to 46 out of 100, and go up from there. Now if the Fury Warrior were to lose and ended the brawl with 86 rage, he would then return to 43 rage out of 50, so it's pretty much all the same. Coming off that note, I wanted to mention a slight change to how the enrage mechanics work. Whenever any warrior enrages, the other warriors can take damage from them. While the bosses will not outright target the other 2 like the arms protection warriors targets players, the AoE that is caused can hurt the other warriors. This mechanic does not only apply to enrage either. Whenever any of the warriors brawl, while minor, they will also take damage from one another. Continuing on the topic of brawls, I did not want a state of constant brawl management being in the fight. So after any brawl is finished, the warriors get a fatigue buff that prevents the brawl from occurring for 20 seconds. This will give the tanks time to separate the warriors again. Not only that, each warrior that is involved with the brawl also gets a stacking buff that increases their damage dealt by 5%. So it may not be smart to purposely have the warriors constantly fighting. Now I have one more mechanic to go over before we're finished with the warrior. I wanted to add something that could counteract the additional damage going out from the warriors being able to attack one another. So I thought having food being thrown into the arena would be an interesting take on healing for the bosses. On occasion, a slab of mutton will be thrown onto the floor. This would cause all 3 of the warriors, regardless of where they are, to run over to that slab and start a 3-way brawl for the meat. Whoever wins this brawl gets the healing from the mutton and also subsequently enrages. At the same time, however, I thought there should be a way to break up the brawl prematurely before any of the other warriors actually enrage. So a second type of food is thrown into the arena: rotten tomatoes. Players are able to pick up tomatoes from the floor and during a brawl can throw it at one of the warriors, causing disorientation and giving the unaffected warrior an edge to immediately win without enraging. This mechanic can be used to also interrupt a 3-way brawl, but it does not stop the victorious warrior from gaining the heal from the mutton. Throwing the tomato also prevents the damage increase buff the warriors would normally get after a brawl that finishes with an enrage. Okay, that does it for the warrior. Now let's not waste any more time and go straight towards the hunter. This version of the fight is actually the second iteration, as I was going to imitate the ideas from Iron Maidens, for those who remember Blackrock Foundry, although with the help from one of my friends, the direction took a complete 180, and for the better I might add. This fight has 3 phases, each equating to 50% of the boss's health. 150% doesn't make too much sense right now, but it will in a minute. The boss starts out as Beastmaster with 2 pets at his side, each having health equivalent to 25% of the boss's health. But until both of the pets die, the boss cannot be damaged because of the spirit bond between him and both of his pets. The first phase is really all about those pets, so the hunter will not do as much in terms of dealing damage, other than a multi-shot attack that causes Beast Cleave. More on that later. Other than that, the hunter will use Bestial Wrath every minute during the first phase, which increases damage dealt by both him and his pets by 20% for 20 seconds. Now let's get on to the pets. They will have two different stances to take, defensive and aggressive. Addressing both stances, they will both have associated stacks that cause the pets to switch between defensive and aggressive. Defensive stance stacks decrease mainly over time and act as a sort of cooldown in order to get the raid to push the aggressive pet to lose stacks of aggression, so that the aggressive may switch to the defensive while the defensive changes to aggressive, and back and forth. However, the defensive stacks can also be reduced by taking damage as well, and speeds the process up for switching. Aggressive stacks are different in that they only take damage to reduce them. You never want the pets to be in the same stance, and before I go into why, I want to cover my bases with what both stances entail. The pet that is currently defensive will have a 50% reduced damage taken buff, and the aggressive pet has a 25% damage increase buff. If both pets are the same for either stance, depending on which one, they get an enhanced version of the appropriate buff. So a 75% decreased damage taken for defensive, and a 50% increased damage dealt for aggressive stance. Now, whenever either pet switches stance, which will be around the same time if done correctly, the pet will do an attack depending on which stance he is taken. If a pet becomes defensive, he does a howl that fears anyone within 10 yards, trying to get them away from him, I'd imagine. And when a pet goes aggressive, he blink strikes to the 3 farthest players away, and does a 5-yard AoE stomp whenever he lands. Also, for both pets, every 25% the boss will call for a stampede, where both pets will jump to the edges of the room and charge to the other side with trails of animals following the main pet. This could be done twice in varying patterns every time. And if you remember from earlier, the hunter will occasionally cast multi-shot that causes Beast Cleave. This Beast Cleave acts as a softened rage, as it is a raid-wide AoE that increases in damage for every time it is dealt. When it comes to specific attacks for either pet, I'd say that a kill command attack could be executed on the tank that is only done by the aggressive pet. This could be the phase's tank switch because proximity is not a problem, but it also puts into consideration whether the tank should switch depending on how soon the next stance change is going to happen. Now that encompasses what the first phase has to offer. The moment both pets die, the boss summons a third pet and equips a spear, thus becoming a survival hunter. This time around, the boss and the pet share health down to 50%, as they do have a spirit bond but not strong enough to prevent the boss from taking any damage. Also different from the first phase, the pet does not do all that much. It is really there to keep both tanks busy. I forgot to mention that upon the phase switch into survival, the boss throws out tar and snake traps onto the floor. You may see where they landed, but after a second they become invisible until you get within 5 yards of the trap. The tar traps, when activated, leave a puddle of tar on the floor that slows players by 30% and prevents them from jumping for 30 seconds. That'll be important. Whenever a snake trap is activated, it makes the snakes spread 5 yards and crawl up onto the players within the range, and they need to jump 3 times to shake the snakes off. Therefore, it'd be advised not to set both the tar and the snake traps off at the same time. The tank switch for this phase comes in the form of Mongoose Strike that increases in damage for every subsequent hit. There is also a mechanic that mirrors the Butcher, as the boss uses Lacerate on the largest group of people within 10 yards of him. I wouldn't want to make that Lacerate as deadly as it was on the Butcher fight, but it'd probably be handled in the same way. Finally, the boss has 2 more traps in store for the raid. In melee distance, the boss will lay down a frost trap that is also invisible until within 5 yards. If anyone steps onto the trap, it encapsulates the player in a block of ice and it must be destroyed to break him out. Although the range will not get off so easily. Instead of a frost trap, the range get a dragonfire trap thrown into their midst. What this trap does is whenever a player steps onto it, the trap explodes for 10 yards around, causing AoE damage and disorients players for 5 seconds. Now mix the disorientation with being surrounded by tar and snake traps. You're gonna have a fun time, especially if more than one person is affected by the disorient. After reaching 50% health, the pet dies and the hunter uses his bow as a last resort, becoming a marksman. All the traps that have been laid out are now gone for this phase. Now this phase revolves mainly around one mechanic: sniper training. Very much like it acted in Warlords, if the hunter stands still for 3 seconds, he gets a damage increase. In terms of this fight, not only does his damage increase, but it also stacks for every second he remains still. Once the hunter begins moving again, the damage increase dissipates over time. As the fight continues, the hunter loses more and more health, and he begins to lose focus, causing his abilities to take longer to cast. The reason this reduced focus is actually a bad thing is because every one of his abilities he casts causes the hunter to stop moving, thus increasing the sniper training damage for standing still for longer to cast them. Now let's go over these abilities. First of all, the boss does a cone sweep attack in the form of barrage, where he will face to his left and just do a half circle to his right, casting barrage in a cone in front of him. Similar to Iron Maiden's, he will target a player for an aim shot that decreases in damage for every player that stands between him and the target. The next attack is something a little interesting, as it sort of plays into the gunslinger idea tossed around for Hunter. This attack is a crack shot where the boss targets 3 players and does a little hat trick on them. His final ability makes the boss disengage into the middle of the room, where he faces all 4 directions in a row to cast Sidewinders. This shot spreads as it gets farther away from the center, and causes anyone hit to gain the vulnerable debuff. This debuff increases damage taken and makes the player easier to focus on and execute his abilities. However, the moment the player gets targeted by an ability, like the crack shot or aim shot that allows the boss to focus quicker, the debuff is taken away. So in the beginning, you do not want to get hit by the Sidewinders, but nearing the end, to avoid getting one shot by the increased sniper training buff, you may want to get hit by the vulnerable debuff to hasten his abilities. Alright, that covers the Hunter's main encounter. Now time for the Mythic mechanics. When it comes to the changes in Mythic, the Beastmaster phase gets a couple of additions. Every 2 minutes, Dire Beast is cast, and every 15 seconds that a beast is up, it allows the boss to summon another, note weaker, Dire Beast. This effect transfers to the weaker Dire Beast after the initial one is killed. But if 2 Dire Beasts happen to be up for 15 seconds, the boss will only summon 1 pet instead of 2, so the mechanic is linear rather than exponential in format. Essentially, while Dire Beast is up, every 15 seconds, 1 more beast will spawn. The next and final change to the Beastmaster phase is that after the Bestial Wrath damage buff disappears, the boss uses Murder of Crows, which of course summons a Murder of weak crow adds that attack the raid at random. Next, the Survival phase. This next phase and the Marksmanship phase do not get that much of a revamp in Mythic, just a simple mechanic addition. In terms of survival, every 20% the boss uses Camouflage and hides away in part of the room to cast a 30-second heal that will heal him for the 20% he lost. Regardless of both he and his pet being hidden by stealth, the pet will leave tracks on the floor that leads to the boss's hiding place. Once found, you'd use flares or AoE damage to reveal the hunter and prevent him from healing. Lastly, the Marksmanship phase gives an extra ability, Volley. This volley attack rains down arrows from the sky and pins anyone hit to the ground until the arrow is broken. I'll say it again. Avoid the swirlies. Alright, now that's 2 bosses down. All we have left is the one and only Druid. The Druid. The ad fight. Well, at least the closest thing this raid has to an ad fight. With what I devised, I hope to remedy some of the things that make ad fights not the most fun or engaging. For a little context, I had wished Blizzard had made Hellfire Assault and Iron Reaver one boss, by having the amount of time it took to destroy the door, and the amount of health Reaver had to make it one fight. I also thought of Gallicrats, and how that fight's dynamic was half ad, half boss, and that's the route I'm taking here with the Druid, a sort of half and half. Now the boss will have 4 phases baseline, 1 for every form. Therefore, every 25%, she will change specialization and buff the adds that come out with the spec's associated buff. The buffs themselves are not too complex. They're mainly there to possibly try to push a different order, perhaps in which you kill the ad waves. The Guardian buff is simply a damage reduction for the adds. This will be the first buff and possibly the wave that lasts the longest. Next is Restoration, which has a little more punch to it, as the buff gives each add a small heal over time that jumps to other adds within 10 yards as they die. If no one is within that 10-yard range, the heal is removed from the total pool of buffs. However, if it does spread to the other adds, the buff will stack on whomever is closest to the add that died. One other feature for the Restoration buff is that it is dispellable in a way. If an add happens to have, let's say, 5 stacks of the healing buff, and it's just too hard to kill, the stacks can be dispelled, removing all the excess stacks down to 1. This action will cause the 4 extra to jump, as if the add had died, and travels in that 10-yard range to stack onto other adds. The balance buff is pretty straightforward and increases haste over time until all the adds have died. And finally, with the Feral buff, it allows adds to become invisible, regardless of roll, for 10 seconds. And I'd say no more than 10 adds at a time would have the buff active at any one point, just for fairness. The makeup of the add waves is the same every time, with 20 coming out to fight the raid. 20 is important because it means you'll be fighting a complete raid group of druids, with 2 being guardians, 4 being healers, and the other 14 as DPS, split evenly at 7-7 for both balance and feral. Now let's talk about the adds. The guardian druid adds are the main focus for the tanks for this intermission phase, as the adds themselves will be the ones taunting and holding aggro on the tanks and anyone else within 10 yards. Restoration adds will throw down healing AoE mushrooms, that are killable, onto the floor that cause any other druid adds to run over to it if they're nearby. They will also focus heal with regrowth on adds that reach 25% health or less. They can be interrupted. Feral adds will focus on stealth and single target damage by snake attacking random players, while the balanced druids stick to the back to channel Starfall for AoE damage on the raid group. And I don't think I mentioned it, but a single wave of adds will come out every 25% for every phase change that the boss incurs. After killing all 20 of the boss's students, the boss runs in as Guardian. This initial phase is somewhat of a DPS check because the boss has a defense buff, Iron Fur, that acts similarly to the Monk Fight's Inebriation buff. The boss begins with a 90% decreased damage taken buff that is reduced by taking damage. When it comes to the phase's mechanics, the boss lifts herself onto her hind legs and smashes onto the floor. This attack causes raid-wide AoE to go out and causes the raid to take more damage from every time it is cast. Now, every 10% while Guardian, the boss goes into a frenzy and thrashes around her for 15 seconds. This thrash only affects the area in front of the boss, but she is constantly moving and circling to try and reach anyone she can in her rage. While in this frenzy, the Iron Fur buff is removed and the raid can do full damage to her, but any damage taken causes her own damage output to increase for this intermission. For the tanks, the boss passively applies a stacking bleed to her main target with her auto attacks. She then, on occasion, uses Mangle, which of course does more damage to anyone that is bleeding, but in the boss's case, the higher the stacks, higher the damage. Once getting to 75%, the boss switches to balance and the add intermission occurs. The adds die and the boss comes down again for the actual fight. As balance, the boss alternates between solar and lunar powers every minute. The moment the shift happens, all the abilities change to their appropriate essence. The boss will start the second phase as lunar, and initially cast Starfall, that is another avoid the swirlies mechanic. The next ability is that the boss casts Moonlight over the entirety of the room, and mimics the cycles of the moon during the lunar phase duration, as darkness makes its way across the room. The players need to avoid the encroaching darkness that is cast over the moonlight in order to avoid inflicting ticking damage on themselves. The next attack is Lunar Strike, which targets 3 random players around the room. Lunar Strike afflicts anyone hit by it with Moonfire, which is a permanent dot that increases in damage while the lunar phase is active, but remains dormant while the solar is active. Although if all 3 afflicted players manage to stack on one another before the 5-second cast is finished, the strike will fall on them and simply do damage and dissipate without applying the dot. When the boss switches to solar after 1 minute, the moonlight that the players were meant to stand in becomes sunlight that the raid needs to now avoid by stepping into the darkness that has now almost completely covered the room. And as a note for the moonlight and sunlight mechanic, the phase change is aligned with the darkness and the light that crawls across the room. So the moment before the room is enveloped by darkness, making a new moon, or covered by light, making complete sunshine, the boss will shift to allow the players time to get over to the non-damaging side. As I stated previously, the lunar abilities switch over to solar upon the phase shift, so Starfall is replaced by pillars of sunlight that actually need to be soaked in order to not have patches of fire appear on the floor. Finally, the Lunar Strike is replaced with Solar Wrath, which has the boss sending missiles of sunlight at 3 targeted players. Instead of stacking this time, the players need to run away from the raid, as upon getting hit with Solar Wrath, they explode in sunlight for 20 yards around them. If anyone is hit within this range, they are afflicted by Sunfire, which acts in the same way as Moonfire, in that it is a dot that increases in damage while the solar phase is active. The targeted players do not get Sunfire placed on them after getting hit by Solar Wrath, unless other raiders are within the range of the explosion. Upon reaching 50%, the boss becomes Restoration, and the adds ensue. The adds die, and the actual boss during her restoration phase does not directly attack the player, as she will consistently cast an uninterruptible heal that attempts to restore damage dealt to her. This heal affects only around 10% of her health for any one cast, but if the DPS is slow, her heal will cause the fight to last a lot longer than it needs to be. The way to inflict damage on the boss during this phase will be killing the 2 types of roots that have begun to sprout from the floor, as the boss has planted herself into the middle of the room. The first type of root has a small plant growing from it that spits poison blobs out of its mouth that needs to have someone within melee range to attack in order to stop the spitting. The blobs themselves are also adds that travel across the room, leaving trails of poison, and upon death leave a puddle of more poison. The second root is a thorny bundle that shoots thorns across the room at players if they stop moving. The thing is though, if a player gets too close to the thorny bush, they are slowed by 50% and take ticking damage the longer they stay within it, because it will move to whomever is currently attacking it. Therefore, the range will be able to handle the thorn bushes while the melee grab the spitting roots, as the spitters will be occupied by meleeing the melee, and the thorn bushes will always be moving to try to reach the ranged people that are attacking them. One other thing to note about the thorn bushes is that once they are killed, they will leave a permanent dead bush that does the same effect of slowing and damaging if anyone runs into it. This will be important later. This phase's mechanics are not over, however. The tanks also get their own little bundle of joy to manage, as a large bracken spore-esque ad comes out to join the fun. The problem that arises with the ad is that if it is within 20 yards of any roots, the roots get a constant stream of healing that prevents them from dying, as the bracken spore ad sends out restorative spores onto them. Not only that, those very spores cause a stacking debuff that eventually leads to mind control for any players within that 20-yard range. They will become mind controlled after getting 10 stacks of the restorative spores. But if the tanks can get away from the group and do their switch correctly, this ad won't be a problem. At least until the next one spawns after 2 minutes. Finally, at 25%, the boss goes feral and the room is in utter shambles with dead thorn bushes everywhere and the last set of ads coming into the fight. But after getting the ads out of the way, the boss is in complete disarray as she takes her last stand against you. This last phase is the most simple, as the boss is now just doing everything she can to wipe out as many of the raid as possible. It's almost in a way saying, if I'm going down, you're going down with me. There's only one thing that the boss does during this phase. She first begins to prowl and move slowly across the room. This makes her invisible and pretty much becomes a game of cat and mouse, as the players need to run around to try to find the boss. A status appears on everyone that reveals they're being watched by someone in the shadows, and it progressively gets more serious as you get closer to the boss's ever-changing location. Within 40 yards, which is probably most people, the indication is that you're being watched. Getting to a 30-yard range tells you that you have shivers running up your spine, and at 20 yards, you're becoming paranoid as you hear crunching of footsteps circling you. Finally, the first person to get within 10 yards is targeted by the boss, and she charges at the player. If she manages to reach you, the boss jumps on top of you and begins to rip and shred at your flesh. She does this until enough damage is done to her, sending her back into the stealth, or the player dies, which causes her to increase her damage and speed as she targets someone else within 10 yards. One thing is still left to consider: the thorn bushes that remained from the previous phase. If the player that is targeted can drag the boss into one of those thorn bushes, it causes her to become stuck, leaving her open for attack. She is stuck until, again, enough damage is done to her, where she breaks free and returns to stealth to repeat the process until death. It's crazy to think that this is only the base fight. And I just want to apologize now for having to almost retract my previous statement about a 5-phase fight being almost overkill. That is because this fight is, yes, indeed 5 phases. But I wanted to reduce the health for each phase down to 20% for consolidation, if that helps any. One other thing is that the ads will only come out in the initial pool at 100% of the boss's health to get the fight started, at 60% right in the middle, and then finally at 20%, ushering in the last phase. When it comes to the phase changes, without the ads being there for intermission, it'll just be a quick boss jumps away and morphs, then re-enters as the new form. Now, at long last, let's jump right into the brand new phase. Upon reaching 20%, after transitioning through all 4 of her forms, the power of nature and the wild revoke themselves from the boss, disallowing her to call for their aid. The boss is now unable to morph into any druidic form, and at this point is lost to what she can do. It is then when a horde of demons bursts through the walls and the boss leaps onto the first that entered her sanctum, tearing out his heart with her bare hands. Pun intended. She gazes at the beating hunk of flesh and remembers the rituals of the many of the demon hunters that aided the people of Azeroth against the Legion. She then devours the heart, bearing the demonic essence to her mind, body, and soul. The boss then takes up the glaives of the defeated demon and calls the others that burst through the walls to her aid. The demons now spawn in intervals throughout the phase and are merely meant to be cannon fodder. These are the ads that I was talking about for this phase. The boss herself has two different forms to take during this last phase, the first being the base Demon Hunter, while the second is her Metamorphosis. While the base Demon Hunter, all the boss's attacks fill up her Fury bar, which is the catalyst to her Metamorphosis at 100 Fury. One note before we get started with the specific mechanics, the boss can also attack the demons with their abilities as well if they manage to get in the way. She's not exactly friends with them. She will not directly target the demons, but if they just so happen to get hit by any AoE, they do take damage, and the boss will generate fury from them. The first ability is that the boss throws her glaives in a circle around her and spread further out over time. This mechanic is akin to the Blessed Hammer ability from the Paladin fight. The main difference from the Paladin fight is that anyone she hits with the glaives is marked by Fel, and at the end of the rotation, the boss charges anyone marked and thus gains fury, increasing with each person hit. Her next ability is a Blade Dance, which is a 10-yard radius attack that she does on occasion. The boss also has an Infernal Strike that targets a random player for a charge. But the moment the player is hit, 8 apparitions of the boss burst from the player in a similar charge in every direction for 10 yards. If anyone is within the range and gets hit by an apparition, the effect continues with another 8 coming from that player as well, so on and so forth. So you'll need to take this charge away. The tank mechanic is a soul cleave that does fire damage for yards around the affected tank, and reduces damage taken from the ability with more people hit. But more people being hit means more fury at the same time. So you'll need to judge how many people need to absorb that incoming damage to help the tank. Finally, after the boss's fury bar is filled, she uses Metamorphosis and mimics several aspects from Illidan as she throws her glaives into the ground and takes flight above the raid. Once taking flight, all the boss's attacks now reduce fury until emptying the bar, which returns her to her base Demon Hunter form. The boss also cannot be attacked during this phase, so clearing out any excess ads that might have built up during the base Demon Hunter form would be advised. When it comes to the boss's abilities during this phase, she, similar to Illidan, targets random players for I-Beam that leaves a trail of Felfire behind them. She also randomly targets 4 players and picks them up off the floor, only to then drop them for the raid to catch. Lastly, as a constant fury diminisher, the glaives also emanate pulses of Fel, causing raid-wide damage. Now, you can get the boss down prematurely, before all of her fury is expended. The raid needs to do enough damage to the glaives to remove them from the floor. Doing this will also stop the pulsing attack from the glaives, and halt that constant fury degeneration once they're uplifted. Secondly, after getting both glaives off the floor, they need to be picked up by players and thrown at the boss within 3 seconds of one another. This will knock her back onto the floor and return her to her base Demon Hunter form. If both glaives do not get thrown in time, the boss resets the glaive or glaives back into their normal placement. Lastly, there is a caveat placed on the table for removing the boss from her Metamorphosis early. If done so, she will gain a buff that increases her fury generation by 10%, and she also starts out with all the fury that remained from her Metamorphosis phase that was not used due to being interrupted, and she will just repeat until she dies. And that's it for the boss. At this point, it'd just be a back and forth between base and Metamorphosis while managing the constant stream of ads. Alright guys, thanks for coming to see the second wing for this little series here. Next time, we will be going over the third and final wing of the raid. Also, I want to know what you guys think of what has been discussed so far. Was there something you would have changed or something that you really enjoyed about these fights? Finally, if you have any questions, quarrels, or queries, be sure to let me know. I am Cucumber, and remember, pass the dressing.